Welcome to She, They, Us, a podcast about making room in housing for women and gender diverse people. My name is Andrea Reimer, and I was elected to Vancouver City Council from 2008 to 2018. I teach about power and policy at the University of British Columbia. I'm a longtime community activist living in Vancouver, and I will be your host for this podcast, which is brought to you by the Pan-Canadian Voice for Women's Housing. Welcome to the 5th episode in our series. Today, we're going to be talking about the experience that trans women have when it comes to housing. I could give you a lot of statistics about how challenging, how dangerous, how difficult life is for trans women in Canada. But I feel like many people have heard those statistics, and it still doesn't connect you to the reality of the world that trans women have to navigate and the discrimination that exists in that world. So we're going to hear about this primarily through the eyes of Susan Gapka. But before we get to her, I have a story from Aaron Munro, who joined us last week. Aaron is a trans person living in Vancouver who works as a counselor currently, but I first met them when I was on city council and they were working to create safe housing for gender diverse youth. To me, this story really summed up why it is so difficult to have policymakers wrap their heads around the world that trans women have to navigate.
Yeah, I had this moment. I was working in this housing project a long time ago, maybe 16, 17 years ago. And there was a woman who I was really fond of. And I could hear her screaming on the street. She'd done something in this housing project. So she had a temporary asked not to come in. And I could hear her screaming my name on the street, and I went running up. I couldn't find her, but I could still hear her yelling. So I started running through this park, and it was completely dark, and I could hear her, but I couldn't see her. And I remember having this really visceral feeling that, why is this happening? I'm half the size of this woman, but society now sees me as male, and I have this class privilege, and society sees her as this trans woman. And so it's okay to victimize her. It's okay for, a violent John to be chasing her. And it makes tons of sense that I can save her, even though it doesn't, when you look at us, it really doesn't make any sense. So when we talk about safety, particularly for trans women who don't have a secure house to live in, and the amount of aggression and violence and persecution they still face in our society, it doesn't, is it class? Is it gender? Is it race? It's all of these things. And if you have a number of those things stacked against you, not everybody, but for lots of people, they did research as part of the Mental Health Commission study. They researched participants 6 months before they were in housing for the levels of violence that they experienced, and the results were pretty stunning, but not stunning. Men and women face the same amount, almost the exact same amount of violence on the streets. The kind of violence, absolutely different, and that's really important to note. Trans people, you had to double it. So if we're looking at populations who need to be included and respected and housed safely, like these folks, it's vulnerable for them to be out there. Again, not everybody, but for some people.
Let's meet Susan Gapka.
Well, my name is Susan Gapka, and I live in Toronto, downtown Toronto, actually, right near the heart of the city. I use she, her pronouns, elle français, s'il vous plaît. I'm very blessed to be I'm in social housing, fought hard to get this housing. We can talk a bit more about that, but I'm an older Caucasian white person with a lot of privilege, but I've lost a lot over my life. So I have a bit of a story to tell you about how that all happened, but I'm in subsidized housing in downtown Toronto, and I want to tell you and the listeners just how important that is for people like myself and others.
I asked Susan to tell us a little bit about how she got to that social housing.
Well, I left home, a small town, military base in Trenton, Ontario. A long time. When I go back 50 years ago, who thought I could say that? Because as a child, I never thought I'd live past 30 years of age. Just had no dreams, no expectations. Things were very difficult for me. I lived in a very toxic household, left home as a teenager, came to the big city lights, and really enjoyed it. But I developed a substance, chronic substance use and alcohol use. And that went on for about 25 years. I eventually ended up on the streets of Toronto. just like a lot of the people we see in the news clips around opioids and other things. And, I had thought that's how my life would end. But about 30 years ago, I realized I had a problem, but I didn't know how to get out of it. And just a little emotional. I hadn't expected to talk about, but I've got to be my true, authentic self here. But it was a really difficult realization. But eventually, I got into some treatment, and then I tried the abstinence journey when I left that situation, and it turned out really well. And what happened after 6 months or a year of being trying to figure out who I was and how to keep the conditions. I had some housing. That was before rents went through the roof. But I always thought, like, once I put that behind me, my life would, I'd be like everyone else. Turns out I had this hope ever since my youngest, since grade eight, well, 8 years old. Ever since a child, these reoccurring themes that I'd always wanted to live as a woman. And so I ended up changing my name to Susan and living as a woman. Oh boy, 1999, 2000. I did that while working at City Hall in Toronto. So that was quite an eye-opening experience for a lot of other people in the public realm, but also for myself as well as I went through that journey. But things have turned out well. Here we are 25 years later.
In the last episode, I told you that I had a trans kid and also that I dealt with poverty and the housing precarity that comes along with that. But I didn't really talk about living on the streets or my time using drugs. When Susan talks about her feelings of hopelessness and the chances of her survival past 30, it really hits home and it's hard not to feel connected to it. We talk about that for a minute.
Who knew? Who knew there was hope? But you see, hope wasn't something I had as a youngster. I knew a lot of fear, a lot of shame, a lot of guilt, and I tried to hide from it. But, and thank you for sharing that you had a similar experience because it can be so self-isolating when you're going through that. And it can be really dark, dark clouds, dark shadows. And so, yeah, here we are.
So back to Susan's story. Just before we dive back in, a note that this story is quite gripping, so I'm not going to be interrupting again, although you will hear me on tape at one point asking Susan if she wants to take a break.
I've got two pieces of mind thinking about renting in an urban, expensive downtown region like Toronto here. And I'm thinking just how hard it must be for so many people with the exorbitant rents and now rampant inflation coming out of the pandemic. And it just seems like what my mama told me so 60 years ago, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer was such a I wish I would have listened to some of the things they said back then, but it was a pretty rebellious one, angry and rebellious. But I tried to get rent when I came out as a trans woman, and I had a hard time finding places to rent, even at market rent. There were shared accommodations, finding most of my disability. I was on disability for the whole time it existed in Ontario. I became a political activist for two reasons. That they were changing the social assistance regime in Ontario in the late 90s, a conservative government. And I wanted to advocate so that I could continue to get some subsidies or be on the system so I could get an education, become, a more involved in society. And so apparently I was pretty good at it because I started being invited to a lot of different organizations and that to talk about my story. And then there was the other thing of just trying to be a student getting housing. So I had several incidences of having to file human rights claims. I learned how to do that really, really well at the university, York University. I spent most of my time writing complaints about incidences of harassment and discrimination in the university sector. And I got so good at it, I became a trans activist And getting access to healthcare as well was a big issue for me. So I became an activist, and maybe it was always inside of me, but a lot of work on trans issues. I have the good fortune to have drafted the Ontario Human Rights Code legislation that was adopted in 2012 that protects gender identity and gender expression. And actually drafting the federal legislation, which I'm very proud of, that took 13 years to be adopted and was adopted in, I believe, about 6 years ago, coming up to 6 years ago at the federal government. So that was really important to me. But like I could have, in another world, I could have like had a career in law perhaps, but I ended up being an activist. But maintaining housing all that time while I'm fighting these battles, these struggles, building consensus, public consensus, and getting more, because it was not, I mean, when we started doing this work, it was like if we get 3 to 5 people together for a rally or protest, that was remarkable. And so I remember we did a protest once, ending it up at Toronto City Hall because it was more accessible, when actually the government at Queen's Park was the one we should have been talking to. So a lot of lessons learned, but having housing during that time was really a challenge. And none of my human rights complaints went through, but I did learn the process pretty well. And during university days, I went to college, got a diploma in community work at George Brown College, ended up going to York University and studied public policy and administration. And I feel that really helped me learn how to write public policy and do things. But all the time, I'm like living in sort of, you know, um, less than desirable housing. So I ended up moving to downtown Toronto because I wanted to run in a municipal election. And I really believe it's important you be part of the neighborhood. And we do have an LGBTQ village here in downtown Toronto. So I moved down here, and it was shared room with another person, and we didn't get along very well. But I didn't have the money, the funds, the resources to get my own apartment because it was just too cost prohibitive. And there was an incident where he called the police, and it's a bit traumatizing. So I'm just going to take a deep breath. Should have had a glass of water with me here, but one day we had a quarrel, and he called the police and said I assaulted him, and I was removed from my apartment, and that was downstairs here. And that was really traumatic after all this work, education, leading what I thought was a pretty community-based, a social engaged life. And then this happened, and it was a horrible, horrible experience. Still a little bit, don't know how much to say about it, but a
Susan,
trans woman, yes.
did you want to grab a glass of water? Like we can stop here and pick it up again.
Yeah, well, I've got coffee there, but I'll do it after this part.
Okay.
I just feel like this might be important for people to know that I was taken away and removed from my apartment without consent. And I thought I'd just get to the police station. I explained what happened. We just had like a roommate argument, and it got turned into this thing where the only way I could be released from detention, they lost my paperwork. It was a day in hell, actually. Oh, and this happened in 2009, and I was running for, I was becoming a candidate for election. So this is playing mind games with me. And so I had to agree to not going to my apartment, losing my apartment, not having contact with my roommate to be released on bail. And the other option was to go to the jail and wait for a bail hearing. So it was a really, really, really bad experience that still is making my heart feel heavy right now. And, if I had been able to get into affordable housing at the time, maybe this wouldn't have happened. But it was a really, really important lesson for me, is like now, luckily, I had turned my life around and had a lot of supports in place. And just taking a deep breath. getting through it. Um, well, one thing that was different now that I had a lot of supports in my life, so people were helping me out, but it was still a really bad experience. And I ended up getting moved into housing in another building. And several years later, I was able to return to this building. But somehow, how I had managed it, I had made good relationships with the people in Toronto Community Housing. But it was during that time that our mayor of Toronto, the never forgetful Rob Ford, tried to sell off Toronto Community Housing as a lot of the single family units. And as a real estate development deal, it seems to be the way his brother carries on nowadays with so many issues. Um, but these were people's lives. They tried to sell our building, the building I was, this is like my life. And I like, after all these years of all these hardships, I have a place to live and it's not great and it's not perfect. And, we don't have the best security, but like a place to call home. Everyone deserves a decent place to live. So, we organized along with some friendly counselors at City Hall. And we were able to save people from being evicted from those homes. So I feel very, very proud of that. Sometimes like this trans legislation is like being the first out trans girl who, known as the getting the sex change surgery in Ontario on that. And there's a lot of stigma with that. People are much more public about that stuff nowadays. But something about housing and housing for vulnerable groups and disadvantaged groups, trans people and gender diverse people and people from all the intersections of race and inequality and indigeneity and disability. That's something that everyone needs. So I'm very, very proud to share that story with you. We managed to stop them from doing that, but the fight's not over. But out of that, after we were successful in that, there was, I guess, the CEO came to me and said, Susan, we're going to look after you. And I didn't know what that meant because like that could have been either really a really good thing. That could be a really, really bad thing because his job was to sell off the housing. He was appointed by a lot of politics in social housing, very political. And we're talking about people's lives, people, bricks and mortar. We're more than bricks and mortar. We all deserve a decent place to live. And turns out I was moved to, eventually they moved me to the apartment I'm in now. And I've been here for a good grief, almost 10 years, but on a rent geared to income subsidy. And I'm very happy. I hope to stay here. I'm very happy, in the grand scheme of things. People will say, well, would you like some of this or some of that? There was a dream I had, getting that job and, getting elected and, buying a condo or a home and having a pool and all that. But, right now, what I have is enough. I have enough. I have a place to live. I have a cat who is not jumping on me right now, but as the minute this conversation is over, is going to come and say, "Hey, what's up? You haven't fed me in half an hour," and I've got enough of the comforts at home to be very, very pleased after my very, very difficult life journey. And I think everyone should have the same opportunities that I have here today.
I asked Susan what her hope is for the future of housing.
When I think of everything I've been through and what the world's been through, today's struggle seems so small, but it's easy for me to say from in my place here, in privilege of having a place to live. People are still, still sleeping in our parks and being encampments from street corners are being I know out in Vancouver they had still happening. I live right near the shelter here, the largest shelter, and people are camped out all around here. And so people are really struggling. It's hard to see, but I think everyone deserves a decent place to live. And the rents have been going up like a commodity that most people can't afford much. It's shared accommodation. But as a trans woman or a gender diverse person, having my own self-contained unit is really, really important. I think it would work. That would be my recommendation. If I had the year of the prime minister, you must ensure that everyone has their own self-contained unit. Sometimes neighbors can be a little bit, I was going to say wacky. I don't know if that's a good word or not. I had a neighbor here. There's a lot of stuff. They were having all night parties for a while, but you got to be able to close that door behind you. And one thing I do is I don't really have a lot of people over. I think because that's been some of my weaknesses have occurred by the negative influences of some people around me. So I find that this is my palace. But I think like if something doesn't get done around here, I don't clean the dishes. Well, I do the dishes. And my cat does something, I get sick on the carpet. What can I do? Be mad at him for like 30 seconds. He has no control over that. But anything that goes wrong in here mostly is my responsibility. So I pay my rent every month. And I just think that for people to have a chance in life, you got to have that basic unit of housing. And I know there's a lot of housing dollars out there now, and we've made it a political priority. But against the competition of big business and development, I always want to be on the side of the people who don't have, because that's what I do. I want to be there for the people who don't have housing, but it's obviously not fast enough. And I think some people have short memories. The National Housing Program was cut about 30 years ago. Provincially, it's been downloaded, and we see those consequences, right? It must be a political priority, and we can't keep electing people who say one thing at election time and turn around and do something different afterwards. I think that's short memories, because I've got some thoughts on some of the public policies, but it's not fast enough. People are dying on our streets, so we need to get it together. Income security, health and wellness, housing, social inclusion. And we kind of need some better landlords too. Better landlords, because land is a commodity and development's a commodity. And so just want to tell everyone out there who's struggling, who's having a hard time with housing, you are valued, you are important, and you deserve a decent place to live. We're going to work till the end of the earth to make sure that happens.
The last word goes to Aaron Munro.
I'm really heartened by the progression I've seen in the last 20 years of women's organizations, not tolerating trans women, but seeing women as women. And I really hope that continues, and that there continues to be a push in that area that also recognizes that trans women also have some unique needs. For instance, having to recover from surgery and trying to find ways to appropriately respond to that is really important. What I would love to see, though, because I do hear the stories from people who go into access women's housing or outreach or sex work services or whatever the programs are. I do hear the stories from women who've accessed that and haven't been treated well, sometimes by staff, a lot of times by other program participants. And I think we need to get better at how we respond and not letting the small stuff go, realizing that each of those what could be seen as a slight can be incredibly painful and set somebody back on their journey for a long time. It's not uncommon for trans people to end up with complex trauma. And I believe that we should meet them in a space that if they are in a shelter and they are a trans woman, they likely have complex trauma and have to be treated, as somebody who's had a very complicated life, and has to be respected and dignified in every interaction we have with them. So I really would love women's organizations to continue doing this really important work and training their staff to know how to respond to transphobia in the moment and to shut it down.
That's it for this week's episode of She, They, Us. Thank you so much for joining us. Next week, we will be looking at the intersection between gender-based violence and housing crisis for women and gender-diverse people and their families. I hope you'll join us. This is She, They, Us, a podcast about making room in housing for women and gender-diverse people. To find out more about the She, They, Us campaign, you can visit the Pan-Canadian Voice for Women's Housing webpage where you'll also find resources from this episode and can add your voice to the army of women and gender diverse people fighting to make room in housing.